Tim Costello, thanks so much for your time this evening.
A pleasure.
Your reaction to the opposition's proposal for deferring more than $400 million in funding for the Australia-Indonesian Education Partnership?
Look, I just don't get it. When the proposition seems to be with charity begins at home, we have to make a choice between 110 million Indonesians that live on less than $2 a day, which is close enough to absolute poverty, or 60% of taxpayers paying $1 a week. And most of them, when you ask them, going, well, it's not too bad. I don't understand this artificial choice. We can do both, not set up a contest between the suffering of Queensland flood victims, cyclone victims, which is our first duty, at the expense of the suffering of people in Indonesia who are living in absolute poverty. So I find the whole proposition a little bit preposterous, really.
Mr. Abbott used that term today, charity begins at home, saying that a program like this has to be looked at when schools in Australia have been damaged or destroyed by natural disasters. From your broad experience, how widely embraced do you believe that sort of view would be held in the Australian public, that charity does begin at home with something like this?
Look, I think every Australian believes your first duty is to fellow Australians. I believe that. I'm the head of World Vision. Unfortunately, there's a subtext. When people say charity begins at home, they often mean, and it ends at home, and any money sent overseas really is a waste, and it's not our responsibility anyway. Behind this proposition, however, is this false choice that somehow we can't do both. And when Australians who reflect for just the barest minute, a nanosecond, will actually understand that even in our suffering, we are still blessed. Every single corner of Australia has an SES. If you're sitting on a roof of a house that's flooded here, the chances are you're going to get rescued thanks to the SES. If you're in Indonesia, if you're in Africa or Pakistan, you're probably going to die. So we are blessed, and therefore a false choice of setting up the suffering is something that I think is quite damaging and dangerous.
Can you tell us a little about this program that exists in Indonesia, the Australia-Indonesian Education Partnership?
Yeah, look, this is a program that came out of a disaster, the tsunami, and I was up there within 24 hours. John Howard's government said wisely, in the $1 billion we're giving, we want a large slab to go to building schools, some 2,075 schools. Why? Because the poor turn to religious institutions, madrasas, for education, and surprisingly, or not surprisingly, they're radicalised. We want proper education across faiths, not just in Banda Aceh, right across Indonesia, that gives hope and aspiration to the poor without radicalisation. And that's very sensible when you think of 84 Australians that lost their lives in Bali, when you think this is a John Howard program that's been assessed as extremely effective, and where former Foreign Affairs Minister Alexander Downer said very clearly, aid is not like a tap that you can turn off and on with every political crisis. A political crisis, if you like, here of a levy or not. I find it dangerous just to be turning off that tap when it's in our interest to keep it running.
I heard a discussion this afternoon involving a politician from each major party, and both of them used the line about Australia being a generous country. From your perspective, how generous do you think Australia is at a governmental level at the moment?
Oh, we're very mean at a governmental level. The confusion is that privately we're very generous. World Vision, thankfully, is a grateful recipient of that. Kiwis, where I am in New Zealand now, and Australians are privately to the World Visions amongst the highest per capita giving. But Australians then make the confusion, the mistake, that means our government is generous. We're the St Vincent de Paul of the world, always giving out, the first to give, most generous. Unfortunately, utterly wrong. Out of 23 OECD countries, we're number 16. Now, the US did not cut aid when Hurricane Katrina hit. The Brits didn't cut aid after floods. Neither is this a left or right issue. Bleeding hearts like Tim Costello and hardheads. A Tory Prime Minister in Britain, David Cameron, has slashed and burnt everything in the British budget because of their unemployment, except one area, aid. ring-fencing aid, saying we will not break our promises to the world's poor, the absolute poor. So there's a reputational risk here for Australia being seen to do this, and we're not generous at a government level. Way behind Britain, way behind others.
Well, further to that, if it is perceived domestically, if it is perceived that it's politically and electorally palatable for aid to be cut as and when required, how confident are you that Australia will keep its promises surrounding the Millennium Development Goals, this fight against global poverty, especially the bipartisan push towards Australia giving 0.5% of its gross national income to aid and development by 2015?
I'm very worried about this, and when you know that the Dutch and the Scandinavian countries are already at the promise all developed nations made of 0.7% of GDP, that's 70 cents in every $100, that Britain's at 0.5 already and going to 0.7 in the next 2 years, Australia's at 0.34. To get to 0.5 with this sort of politics is very worrying. We made promises at the UN to the poorest in the world that we would get to 0.5 by 2015. The only nation that really survived the global financial crisis, the only nation that is close to the world's poor. They're in our region. They're a long way from Europe and America. And a nation that is way behind in keeping our promises. And now this. We're going to cut $400 million in Indonesia. It's very worrying for me for us to keep our promises around Millennium Development Goals.
You quoted former Foreign Minister Alexander Downer there before, and 14 years ago he said Australia's aid program is a clear statement of Australian values. How much do you think those values could well be changing, even diminishing?
I think Australians really speak out of ignorance. The ignorance is that somehow there's this big bundle of money and we just choose whether to dole it out, or we can now keep it for our Queensland flood victims. In fact, we've had contracts with the world for aid programs that are long-term, that when they're cut, cause terrible poverty, cause a breach of reputation, cause, even with that breach, a damage to our reputation, potentially economic damage. The countries that we give aid to, $130 billion of export comes back to us. That's also $5 billion of that $130 billion comes from Africa. These countries, when Australia just so easily cuts aid, can this nation be trusted? So this isn't just a big pot of money where we can easily just say, oh, we'll withhold a little bit. These are contracts. These are clear commitments. This is damage to our reputation. And with Indonesia, when we're trying to convince them of dealing with boat people smugglers, when we're getting up a regional detention and reception centre. So I think these knock-on effects need to be thought about.
In those knock-on effects, beyond Australia's reputation, beyond economic impact, to look at the other end, you've seen a lot of cases where I guess the personification of an answer to this question, when people say, well, what difference does it make? What difference does it make?
In Africa, it's a child who gets a mosquito net that's treated with insecticide, which literally saves that child and their family's life. The eradication of polio, which saves children's lives. The extraordinary progress that we have made where 25 years ago 60,000 children died every day between the age of 5 of preventable disease and malnutrition. 2 years ago that figure was down to 30,000 kids dying every day. Today it's 24,000 kids dying every day. We are making huge progress because we take aid seriously.
How do you get that message across then to the broad Australian public to touch into that renowned generosity so they think less about aid dollars and more about lives changed or saved? How do you reconfigure your message?
I think it's reminding Australians that we're not the St Vincent de Paul, the lone person being generous and the first and foremost. We're actually way down the pack. So we're not making a sacrifice that's significant, really, compared to lots of other nations. Secondly, that when you actually see, as I do, whether it's private giving or aid giving, we are making poverty history. We're saving lives. We're giving parents who, if they can't feed their children, give them an education, feel a terrible failure. We're giving those parents hope. We're giving their children the possibility to really experience the dream every one of us has, challenging the lottery of latitude that says, if you're thrown up on the stage of life called Australia, you've got everything: clean water, universal health, education. If you're born in East Timor or Africa or Indonesia, then you're way behind the pack on the lottery of latitude. You've drawn last ticket in that lottery. Telling those stories are what's so important.
Tim Costello in Auckland tonight. Thanks so much for your time.
That's a pleasure.